All right. Well, good morning and thank you for that introduction, my brother. He always adds an extra. But thank you for having me here. And I'm going to just jump right in for the interest of time. And we're going to talk about a few things about family law. And I'm going to talk about three main topics: what's decided in a family law courtroom, some common myths I often hear when I'm doing consultations about family law, and then if time permits, we're going to talk a little bit about Dre. So, what do family law courts, especially family law courts in the Inland Empire, because that's where I practice most of the time, what do we decide? We decide the issues of divorce. We call it a dissolution in California. We decide issues regarding to legal separation, child custody, child support, spousal support, property division, and domestic violence restraining orders. And there's a lot of subsets within that, but those are the major issues that we're dealing with. When you say I need a family law attorney, that's what we normally do. What the family courts do not decide are guardianships. So that's where one or both of the parents are not fit to be parents for a time, so someone else comes in. That's dealt with a different court. Conservatorships, when you have someone over the age of 18 that needs someone else to make decisions for them. We don't do that in the family court. We don't do probate. So if one of your family members passes and we have to handle their estate, that's not done in the family law court. In fact, guardianships, conservatorships, and probates are all handled in the probate court. Family law courts don't necessarily do adoptions. The judicial officer may handle adoptions, but adoptions are handled on their own day, on their own time, in a closed setting. And we also, in family law court, we don't deal with issues of juvenile dependency, which means that there's some sort of mistreatment or some sort of family issue that needs to be helped out by the court, or delinquency when somebody under the age of 18 commits a crime. So, let me tell you a few things that I hear about that causes people to have to come to me after things are done. One of the most important things is you are not automatically divorced 6 months after you file the paperwork. At least once a year, I have somebody that comes in and they're like, oh, I have a wedding scheduled, and they're telling me I'm not divorced. And it's because you are not divorced until you get paperwork from the court that says you've been restored to the status of a single person. So if you're moving on, make sure you get that paperwork before you try to get married to someone else. Another very common myth is a lot of people think, oh, if I live with somebody for a certain number of years, I often hear 7 years, that I am married by common law. There is no common law marriage in the state of California. So there are things that you can do. There are agreements that you can make as single people, but if you don't put it down in writing, you can't get helped in the family law court, and even if you aren't married, your issue goes over to the civil court. Another issue that is really big right now is people say, if I buy something in my own name, it's mine. And it often comes up when people buy houses. In California, if you buy something during the course of your marriage, we automatically think that it's community property. Are there times where it could be different? Yes, but don't just assume just because your name is on it, it's yours. That also applies to retirements as well. Along the same lines, when I get people in, they're like, my spouse ran up all of this credit card debt. Why am I responsible for that? And that's because just like everything that you purchase is considered to be community property, all your debts are considered to be community property. And that's not to say that, you can't get somebody in there to fight for you, fight for your rights, but just consider that you start off with the presumption that that debt is yours. One very big exception is student loans. Student loans usually follow the person that gets those loans. Another thing that would take away from my business, but I'm okay with it, prenuptial agreements are not only for rich people. And there are two reasons why prenuptial agreements are very good. The first is the obvious one. If for some reason your relationship doesn't work out, you have a blueprint for how you're going to divide your assets and how you're going to go your very separate ways. The other thing that's really good about a prenup is it causes the parties to think about what they're doing before they walk down the aisle and they say, I do. Like, let's think about if there's kids that existed before the relationship, how we'll handle those kids, whether those kids will be in our will, how will we deal with our parents, How is our property going to be handled? It kind of makes things a lot easier, a lot cleaner, and it makes sure that the two of you guys are on the same page. In the last 2 years, I've had so many consultations from people that are very COVID conscious. So they have decided that they're going to take care of their kids and they're going to stop all visitation because the other parent is not COVID conscious. And it's not to say that the courts won't believe you. It's just if you haven't gone to the court to seek a modification of your orders, anytime you stop a parent from their court-ordered parenting time, that can create major problems for you in the future. So I would suggest if parents aren't on the same page about how to handle COVID restrictions, you talk about it, but if not, go to the court, ask the court to help you come up with some sort of plan that's in the best interest of your children. Another one I hear all the time, my name is on the birth certificate, so I have the same rights as the other parent. That is true and not true, right? You do have something that says, I am the parent of this child. But if you don't have court orders and one parent decides, I'm going to keep the kid and I don't want to share the kid, there's nothing that can be done about it. So it's very important that even in good times, you establish some sort of something on paperwork so that you know how you're sharing your children, because without court intervention and something happens and you call the police, there's nothing for them to enforce. Another thing that was happening a lot in the last couple of years because kids were doing distance learning, parents were deciding, oh, I'm going to Arizona for the weekend, I'm going to Oregon, I'm going to Nevada because I get to do it, it's my kids. That's not necessarily something that you can do. If you are engaged in the process of a dissolution or a petition to establish parental relationship, automatically as soon as that paperwork is filed, there's an order that goes into place that says neither parent can take the children out of state without the other parent's permission or a court order. And then in this area, for the majority of agreements that are made or orders that are made from the judge, they usually include a provision that says you can't take the children out of state without the other parent's knowledge. And in some cases, they require that you do it with the parent's consent. This is very important because I have had parties lose custody of their kids because they're just like, I'm going to do what I want to do. It's my kids. It's just a trip that I drove to. But it's really important that you follow the court orders and make sure that you don't take the kids out of state. Here's another one. A lot of people believe that if I have a 50-50 custody, that there's not a child support order. This is false. Not only is it false, you could be a parent who technically spends more time with the children and end up having to pay child support to that other parent. Because California uses this complicated guideline calculator to figure out what the child support number should be. And based on that, which uses the timeshare as part of the factors, the number comes out the way it comes out. I always think about when I was a very young attorney, I had a case where one parent had 90% custody and the other parent had 10%. But the parent that had 90% custody made so much more money than the other parent that that parent actually had to pay the other parent $110 a month for child support for them seeing their child. So it's very complicated, but the thing to think about is child support is supposed to be for the children to kind of normalize their lifestyle between the two homes. And it's hard because you always hear someone saying, well, I'm paying the custodial parent the money and they're going out and they're spending money on themselves, making themselves look good, and it's not going towards my kids. But the presumption is that there should be some sort of support for your kids, and that money is for your kids and not necessarily for the other parent. There is also a law out there that says that the court can terminate child support if a parent is alienating, keeping the kids from the parent that's paying support. However, do not stop paying support just because a parent is keeping you from seeing the other kid. A court order remains valid until there's another court order. So If the court hasn't said that the custodial parent is keeping the kids away from the other parent, and therefore you don't have to pay child support, continue paying it, because child support is a beast. And when you fail to pay your child support payments on time, it gains interest at a rate of 10%. You can't even put money in a savings account and get interest at a rate of 10%. So that's a pretty stiff penalty. It's very important that you try to stay on top of things when it comes to your child support. So in the last few minutes that we have here, there's been a lot of talk about the divorce of Dr. Dre and Nicole Young. And so just a few of the basics. They were married for 24 years. And prior to marriage, they entered into a prenuptial agreement. And we already know that at the time that Dr. Dre and Nicole Young got married, he already had some assets. He already had some net worth because the days of NWA and all of that were already in place before they got married. But during their marriage, Dre's net worth grew exponentially, right? We all heard about how much he started making. So eventually their marriage didn't work out, and Nicole Young, who's an attorney, decided to file for dissolution of marriage. And she used carefully crafted language to tell the court that the prenup was invalid. She basically said that she was intimidated and forced into signing that prenuptial agreement, which contractually, if you're forced into signing an agreement, it cannot be valid. And then she also said 2 years into the marriage, he felt ashamed that he forced me into signing this prenuptial agreement, so he ripped it up, and both of us agreed that the prenup is no longer valid. So, I mean, I have my thoughts. I'm not privy to the case, but I do believe that because she's an attorney, she carefully crafted that language. But without, if she was correct that he tore it up after 2 years of marriage, then the question becomes, was that prenup valid for 2 years? And then it gets torn up for the remainder of their marriage, the last 22 years. If she's correct, then everything that Dre created, because remember we talked about the community estate, everything he created during that time, does that now have to be divided 50-50? What do we have to go through to figure out what was his separate property before they got married? What is his community property? What is the natural result of all of this? So I think the parties thought about the plan of how to figure out who was entitled to what, the time. Dissolutions are very emotional. Sometimes they take a toll on your financial health. And I think that's why these two parties were able to come to an agreement. So one thing that's important to note is that this court never got the opportunity to rule on whether or not her claims are valid. So that is not one of the issues. But when they came to their settlement, everyone saw Nicole Young gets $100 million. And instantly the thought was, she got $100 million. She made out like a bandit. And don't get me wrong, I would love to get a settlement for $100 million. But let's look at how they ended up in the end. So at the end of the day, Nicole Young gets $100 million. And she's getting that in 2 payments. She gets $50 million. I believe it was last year that she signed the agreement. She'll get another $50 million this year. She got 4 cars. She got her personal items that Dre put into storage, and she gets no spousal support, which in California, when you have a marriage of longer than 10 years, there's a presumption that you're supposed to get spousal support for life. Now, let's look at what Dre got. Based on the paperwork at the time, Dre was worth $800 million. So he still keeps $700 million. He keeps 7 properties. He keeps his master recordings, his trademarks, his interest in all his various partnerships and trusts, all of the Apple stocks, and all of the proceeds from Beats by Dre. And one of the reasons why that is so important, especially when we talk about the master recordings and the trademarks, is those are assets that build income in the future. So Dre can continue to rebuild and make more money while Nicole's interest in all of that stopped at this point. He also got 6 cars. So in looking at this, the question is, how did they do from where they started to where they finished? My opinion is they both came out okay, because Dre ran the risk of her getting a whole lot more than $100 million. If the court said Nicole was right, and not to be too personal, but by calling her by her first name, but if she was right, he stood ground for paying her almost $400 million and 3 of the properties, or selling all of his properties, and 5 of the 10 cars, and having to be tied to her forever because she's into his interest. And I would be very happy to get $100 million in my cars, So I think from the outside looking in, this is one of those settlements that I wish that a lot of my clients would look at and basically say sometimes it's better to buy your peace and be done with each other and just move on. And so that's all I have for us this morning, and thank you for having us here.